She eats like a pig." The whole town laughed, until the mountain man made them pay the price. The sun hung low over Dustridge, a ramshackle town clinging to the eastern slopes of the Rockies like a tick on a dog's hide. It was late autumn in 1789, and the streets were thick with mud from recent rains. Wooden buildings leaned against each other as if drunk, their paint peeling like sunburned skin. The town lived on two things: the trickle of gold still found in nearby streams, and the currency of gossip, which flowed far more freely than any precious metal. Clara Brennan pushed her handcart through the muddy main street, her boots squelching with each step. The cart was laden with fresh-baked bread, apple pies still warm from the oven, and jars of preserves that gleamed like jewels in the afternoon light. She'd been up since before dawn, kneading dough and stoking fires, preparing goods to sell at the weekend market. Her round face was flushed from exertion, wisps of auburn hair escaping from beneath her bonnet. "Lord have mercy, here comes the pig girl!" someone shouted from the porch of the Silver Spur Saloon. Clara's hands tightened on the cart handles, but she kept walking. She'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse. "She eats like a pig!" Another voice joined in, followed by a chorus of laughter that echoed off the buildings. "Probably ate half her inventory on the way here." Martha Wickham, the mayor's wife, stood outside the general store with 3 other women. They wore their Sunday best, despite it being Saturday, their faces pinched with the peculiar satisfaction that comes from looking down on others. "It's shameful, really," Martha said loudly enough for Clara to hear. "A young woman letting herself go like that. No wonder no decent man will have her. Maybe she's saving up to eat her husband when she catches one." This from Billy Crothers, the blacksmith's apprentice, who slapped his knee at his own wit. Clara felt heat rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cooking fires. She was 23 years old, and for every one of those years since she'd turned 12, she'd endured variations of the same cruel jokes. Her father had died in a mining accident when she was 15, and her mother had followed him into the ground 3 winters later, leaving Clara alone with nothing but a small cabin, her mother's recipes, and a town full of people who found entertainment in her suffering. She set up her stall in the market square with practiced efficiency, arranging her goods despite the trembling in her hands. The bread sold quickly. Say what they would about her, no one could deny Clara Brennan could bake, but each transaction came with a side helping of mockery. "Surprised you left any for us, Clara," said Mrs. Peterson, examining a loaf with theatrical suspicion. "Didn't sneak a few bites on the sly?" By the time the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Clara had sold most of her inventory, and her heart felt like lead in her chest. She packed up her remaining goods, counting the coins in her purse, enough for flour, sugar, and perhaps a bit of salt. She'd make it through another week. The journey home took her past the edge of town and onto a narrow trail that wound through pine forests. Clara usually found peace in this walk, away from prying eyes and cutting words. Today, however, her mind was elsewhere, replaying the day's humiliations, and she failed to notice when she took a wrong turn at a fork in the path. By the time she realized her mistake, the sun had dipped below the mountain peaks, and shadows pooled between the trees like spilled ink. Clara stopped, looking around with growing concern. She didn't recognize this part of the forest. The trail had narrowed to barely a deer path, and the air had turned cold with the swiftness of mountain weather. A branch snapped behind her. Clara whirled around, her heart suddenly pounding. Two eyes gleamed in the gathering darkness, reflecting what little light remained. The wolf stepped onto the path with deliberate slowness, its lips pulling back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers. It was enormous, its shoulders level with Clara's waist, its gray coat thick with winter growth. She'd heard about the wolves that came down from the high country when food grew scarce. Old prospectors told stories around campfires about packs that could strip a horse to bones in minutes. Clara backed away slowly, her cart forgotten, her eyes locked with the predator's amber gaze. The wolf's muscles bunched beneath its fur. Before it could spring, a figure dropped from the rocks above with the silence of falling snow. The man was massive, dressed in buckskin and fur, with a thick black beard and hair that fell past his shoulders. He placed himself between Clara and the wolf, spreading his arms wide and releasing a roar that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. The wolf hesitated, its ears flattening against its skull. The man roared again, louder. Taking a step forward, he pulled a long knife from his belt, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight. For a long moment, man and beast faced each other in a contest of wills. Then the wolf lowered its head, turned, and melted back into the forest. The man waited until the sound of the wolf's retreat had faded completely before turning to face Clara. Up close, he was even larger than she'd first thought, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox and hands that could probably crack walnuts between the fingers. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale blue like winter ice, but somehow warm despite their color. "You're lost," he said. His voice was deep, roughened by disuse, as if speaking were a skill he rarely practiced. Clara found her own voice stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat. She managed to nod. "Cabin's not far. Storm coming." He gestured to the darkening sky, where clouds were gathering with ominous speed. "You'll freeze out here." Before she could respond, he'd already started walking, assuming she would follow. Clara grabbed her cart and hurried after him, grateful for his long stride that cleared a path through the underbrush. Within minutes, the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and wet, clinging to her hair and eyelashes. The cabin appeared suddenly, as if conjured from the mountainside itself. It was built against a cliff face, constructed from logs so perfectly fitted they seemed to have grown together. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and warm light glowed from a single window. The man pushed open the door and waited for Clara to enter. The interior was sparse but scrupulously clean. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the space smelled of pine smoke and something cooking. Venison stew, Clara's nose told her. There was a table hewn from a single piece of timber, 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a bed covered in furs in the corner. Animal pelts hung from the walls, and tools were arranged with military precision on pegs. "Sit," the man said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "Warm yourself?" Clara obeyed, peeling off her wet shawl with trembling fingers. The man ladled stew into a wooden bowl and placed it before her with a spoon. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the scent of meat and wild herbs. "Thank you," Clara managed, "for the wolf and for this." The man gave a slight nod and settled into the other chair with his own bowl. They ate in silence, Clara's initial fear gradually ebbing in the warmth of the fire and food. She studied her rescuer from beneath her lashes. His face was weathered but not old. Perhaps 35, she guessed. There was a scar across his left cheekbone, and his hands bore the calluses of hard work. "I'm Clara," she said finally. "Clara Brennan, from Dustridge." "Silas." He didn't offer a last name. "Do you live here alone?" "Yes." "Don't you get lonely?" Silas was quiet for so long Clara thought he wouldn't answer. "Less lonely than in town," he said finally. Something in his tone made Clara look at him more closely. There was pain there, old and deep, like a wound that had healed crooked. She recognized it because she carried the same kind of pain herself. "I understand," she said softly. His pale eyes met hers, and for the first time, something like surprise flickered in their depths. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, turning the world beyond the window into a white blur. Silas stood and added more wood to the fire. "Storm will last through the night. You'll stay here. I'll take the floor." "I couldn't." "You will." It wasn't harsh, just a statement of fact. Trails already buried. Be suicide to go out there now. Clara wanted to argue, but the howl of wind around the cabin's eaves convinced her. She nodded, and Silas began arranging furs on the floor near the hearth. "The stew was very good," Clara ventured, "though it could use a bit more salt and maybe some rosemary if you can find it growing wild." Silas paused in his work, looking at her with what might have been amusement. "You know cooking." "It's what I do. I sell baked goods and preserves in town." She hesitated. "What do you do up here?" "Hunt, trap, prospect a little." He gestured to the pelts on the walls. "Sell furs when I need supplies." "Don't you ever come to town?" "Sometimes, when necessary." His jaw tightened. "People talk. I don't like talk." Clara felt a kinship with this strange, solitary man that defied explanation. They were both refugees from the cruelty of idle tongues, though their responses had been different. She'd stayed and endured. He'd fled to the mountains. That night, lying in Silas's bed while he slept on the floor, she'd tried to insist on the opposite, but he'd been immovable. Clara stared at the ceiling and listened to the storm rage outside. For the first time in years, she felt safe. When Clara woke, the world had been transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep outside the cabin, and icicles hung from the eaves like crystal teeth. Silas was already up, stoking the fire and preparing breakfast, salted pork and johnny cakes cooked on a flat stone. "Trail will be clear by noon," he said, sliding a plate toward her. "I'll guide you back." Clara ate slowly, reluctant for the morning to end. Here in this cabin, she was just Clara, not the object of mockery and scorn. Here, Silas looked at her and saw a person, not a punchline. "Thank you," she said when they'd finished. "For everything. The wolf, the shelter, the food." Silas nodded, but didn't meet her eyes. True to his word, by noon the storm had passed, leaving the world blinding white and breathtakingly beautiful. Silas loaded Clara's cart onto a sled and led the way down the mountain, breaking trail through the snow with seemingly tireless strength. He left her at the edge of Dustridge, where the snow was already melting into the muddy streets. "Silas," Clara called as he turned to go. "Would it be all right if I came back? To visit, I mean. I could bring food, proper meals, as a thank you." He studied her for a long moment. "If you want." It wasn't enthusiastic, but it was permission. Clara smiled, and something flickered across Silas's weathered face before he disappeared back into the forest. Over the following weeks, Clara made the journey to Silas's cabin every few days, each time bringing a basket of food. She brought fresh bread still warm from the oven, meat pies with flaky crusts, jars of pickled vegetables, and sweet cakes fragrant with cinnamon. At first, Silas seemed uncomfortable with the offerings, but gradually he relaxed, even beginning to anticipate her visits. They fell into an easy rhythm. Clara would cook, while Silas worked on repairs to his cabin or cleaned pelts. They talked little at first, but the silence between them was comfortable, free of judgment or expectation. Slowly, in fragments and pieces, they began to share their stories. Silas had been a soldier once, Clara learned, fighting in skirmishes against British forces that still harried the frontier. He'd seen things that haunted him, done things that weighed on his soul. When he'd returned to civilization, he found he couldn't bear the pettiness and cruelty of ordinary life, the way people hurt each other with words and gossip when they weren't hurting each other with weapons. "Mountains don't judge," he said one afternoon while Clara stirred a pot of stew. "Don't lie. Don't pretend to be something they're not." Clara told him about her parents, about growing up as the girl everyone whispered about the daily humiliations that had become as routine as breathing. She told him things she'd never told anyone, and Silas listened with an attention that felt like a precious gift. "Why stay?" he asked. "In that town? With those people?" Clara considered the question while she sliced vegetables. "It's home, or the closest thing I have to one, and maybe—" She paused, searching for words. "Maybe I'm afraid that if I run, they win, that I'm admitting they're right about me." Silas's hand covered hers, his calloused palm warm and rough. "They're not right. They're cruel. There's a difference." Something shifted in that moment, subtle as a change in the wind, but no less profound. Clara looked up into Silas's pale blue eyes and saw not pity, but respect, even admiration. Her heart, which she'd thought too bruised to feel anything beyond pain, gave a tentative flutter. The seasons turned, and winter gave way to early spring. The trail to Silas's cabin became Clara's favorite place in the world, and the cabin itself felt more like home than the small house in Dustridge where she lived alone. Silas began to smile more, laugh occasionally at Clara's dry observations about life in town. He taught her to recognize animal tracks, to identify edible plants, to move quietly through the forest. She taught him to appreciate subtle flavors in food, to see cooking as an art rather than mere sustenance. One evening in early April, as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Silas spoke quietly. "I was wrong about being less lonely in the mountains." Clara turned to look at him. "Not lonely at all now," he continued, his eyes on the distant peaks. "Not when you're here." Clara's breath caught. "Silas." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw in his face what she'd been afraid to acknowledge in her own heart. It wasn't the desperate, grasping need she'd imagined love might be. It was something quieter, deeper, a recognition of kindred spirits, a mutual understanding that neither of them had to face the world's cruelty alone anymore. "Stay," Silas said. "Not just for a visit. Stay." Clara wanted to say yes. The word was on her lips, ready to tumble forth. But reality intruded, cold and harsh as a mountain winter. "I can't just disappear. People in town, they'd—" "Let them talk. It's not that simple." Clara twisted her hands in her lap. "I have a house, obligations. I sell my goods at market. It's how I survive." "You could survive here, with me." The offer was tempting, so tempting it ached. But Clara had spent her entire life being talked about, being the subject of gossip and derision. If she simply vanished into the mountains with Silas, the stories would grow even worse. More than that, some stubborn part of her refused to slink away in shame, as if she had something to be ashamed of. "Give me time," she said finally. "Let me think about how to do this properly." Silas nodded, though disappointment shadowed his features. Word of Clara's frequent trips to the mountain had not gone unnoticed. In a town like Dustridge, where entertainment was scarce and gossip was currency, her absences were remarked upon, speculated about, and eventually transformed into scandal. "I heard she's been visiting that hermit up on the mountain," Martha Wickham said to her circle of friends, her voice dripping with false concern. "The mountain man, they call him, that wild creature who comes down once a season to trade furs." "Surely not," gasped one of her companions, though her eyes gleamed with interest. "It's true. My husband saw her heading up the trail with a basket. Can you imagine? A respectable woman visiting a man unchaperoned?" The irony that Clara had never been considered respectable before was lost on Martha. The gossip spread through Dustridge like wildfire through dry grass. By the time Clara came to town for the next market day, the whispers had evolved into certainty, and certainty had bred contempt. "Heard you been keeping company with the wild man," Billy Crothers called out as Clara set up her stall. "What's the matter? Even the hermit desperate enough for you now." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "Probably feeds her. That's why she goes," someone else added. "Lord knows the mountain man hunts enough to feed an army. Perfect for our Clara." Clara's hand shook as she arranged her bread, but she kept her head high. These were old wounds they were prodding, familiar pain. She could endure it. But later, as she packed up her remaining goods, a group of young men approached her stall. Their leader was Tom Wickham, the mayor's son, a spoiled boy of 20 who'd never worked a day in his life and believed the town belonged to him by birthright. "So it's true then," Tom said, leaning against her cart with affected casualness. "You've been whoring yourself to the mountain man." Clara's head snapped up. "How dare you? Why else would a woman visit a man alone? Unless—" Tom made a show of looking her up and down with exaggerated disgust. "Unless he's so desperate for company, he doesn't care what he's getting. Even a pig will do when you're lonely enough, I suppose." His friends howled with laughter. Something in Clara snapped. Years of endured mockery, of swallowed pride and silent suffering, crystallized into white-hot anger. "You don't know anything about him or me, don't I? I know you're a pathetic old maid who's deluded herself into thinking that savage on the mountain actually cares about you." Tom's smile was cruel. "Face it, Clara, he's probably just using you for your cooking. Or maybe he keeps you round for laughs, same as we do." The words struck deeper than any before because they touched her deepest fear, that Silas's kindness was somehow false, that even he saw her as the town did. "You should leave," Clara said quietly, gathering her belongings. "Or what? You'll sick your wild man on us?" Tom laughed. "I'd like to see him try. My father runs this town. That hermit comes down here making trouble. We'll string him up faster than he can blink." Clara hurried away, Tom's laughter following her like a curse. As she walked the trail toward Silas's cabin, tears finally came, hot and bitter. Not because of Tom's words, she'd heard worse, but because of the kernel of doubt they'd planted. What if Tom was right? What if Silas merely tolerated her presence because she brought him food, because he was too polite to tell her to leave? By the time she reached the cabin, her eyes were red and her face blotchy. Silas took one look at her, and his expression darkened. What happened? Clara tried to brush it off, but Silas was persistent. Eventually, the whole story spilled out. Tom's accusations, the town's gossip, the threats against Silas himself. With each word, Silas's face grew stonier until he looked like something carved from the mountain itself. They threatened you? His voice was very quiet, very dangerous. They're just talk. Tom Wickham is a bully and a coward. He made you cry? Clara wiped her eyes. I'm fine. You're not. Silas knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. Clara, listen to me. I don't care what that town thinks. I don't care what they say. You're the bravest, kindest person I've ever known. You have more courage in your smallest finger than all of them combined. But what if... No. Silas's grip tightened. No what-ifs. I know my own heart. You're not here because I tolerate you. You're here because when you're not here, the world feels empty. You're here because you make me want to be part of the world again instead of hiding from it. You're here because He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. Because I love you. Clara's breath caught. You... what? I love you, Silas repeated more firmly. Your kindness, your strength, your laugh, the way you hum when you cook, the way you look at the mountains like they're painted just for you. All of it, all of you. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks again, but these were different. I love you too. Silas pulled her into his arms, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years, the bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. But their moment of peace was short-lived. 3 days later, Tom Wickham and 6 of his friends rode up to Silas's cabin. Clara was inside, kneading dough for bread, while Silas sharpened his hunting knives on the porch. The sound of horses made him look up, his eyes narrowing. Tom sat his horse with the arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. His companions spread out in a semicircle, blocking the trail. They were armed, rifles, pistols, hunting knives, though they wore their weapons with the casual confidence of men who'd never had to use them in earnest. "Mountain Man," Tom called out, "we need to have a talk about you corrupting decent women." Silas stood slowly, setting down his whetstone. "Turn around. Go home." "See, that's not going to work. My father's the mayor, and he sent me to deliver a message. Stay away from Clara Brennan. We don't need your kind coming down from the mountains and taking advantage of simple-minded girls." Inside the cabin, Clara heard every word. She moved to the window, her heart pounding. "Clara makes her own choices," Silas said evenly. "Does she? Or are you manipulating her? Everyone knows she's not right in the head. All those years of being the town joke must have addled her brain. Why else would she associate with an animal like you?" Silas's hands flexed, but his voice remained calm. "Last chance. Leave." Tom laughed and drew his pistol, though he kept it pointed at the sky. "Or what? You'll make us? There's 7 of us and 1 of you, hermit. And if anything happens to us, the whole town will come up here and burn your little cabin to the ground." "Then I guess I'll have to make sure nothing happens to you," Silas said, and moved. He was faster than a man his size had any right to be. Before Tom could react, Silas had crossed the distance between them and yanked him from his saddle. The pistol went flying, and Tom hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Tom's friends reached for their weapons, but Silas already had his knife at Tom's throat. "Nobody moves," Silas commanded, his voice like grinding stone. Everyone froze. "Now," Silas continued, "here's what's going to happen. You boys are going to ride back to Dustridge and tell the good mayor that his son is alive because I let him live. Tell him that Clara Brennan is under my protection and anyone who troubles her answers to me. Understood?" One of Tom's friends, braver or stupider than the rest, raised his rifle. "Let him go, or—" Silas's free hand flicked, and a throwing knife buried itself in the tree trunk inches from the man's head. "Or you'll what? Shoot me? Then your friend here dies, and you'll have to explain to the mayor how you got his son killed. How do you think that'll go?" The man lowered his rifle. "Smart." Silas hauled Tom to his feet and shoved him toward his horse. "Ride, all of you, and don't come back." They went, Tom nursing his bruised pride and sore backside, his friends casting nervous glances over their shoulders. Silas watched until they disappeared down the trail before retrieving his throwing knife and returning to the cabin. Clara met him at the door. "That was reckless. They were threatening you. They were just talk and bluster." "Maybe." Silas's eyes were hard. "But I won't risk it. Won't risk you." Clara wanted to argue, but the fierce protectiveness in Silas's expression stole her words. Instead, she took his hand and drew him inside, where they sat together by the fire, neither speaking, both knowing that this was far from over. Tom Wickham returned to Dustridge humiliated and furious. His father, Mayor Aldrich Wickham, was not pleased to hear that his son had been manhandled by a mountain hermit. But Aldrich was a politician, which meant he understood that direct confrontation had failed. It was time for subtler methods. He began spreading a different kind of rumor. The mountain man, he suggested in careful conversations, was dangerous, unstable. Everyone had seen how he lived, alone, isolated, more animal than man. What if he snapped? What if he decided to come down from his mountain and take what he wanted from the town? "He's already corrupted poor Clara," Aldrich said sadly to the town council. "Isolated her from decent society. Who knows what he might do next?" The seed of fear took root quickly in Dustridge's fertile soil. Within a week, people who'd known Clara her entire life were avoiding her at market. Shopkeepers who'd always sold her supplies suddenly had nothing in stock when she came calling. "I'm sorry, Clara," said Mr. Henderson, who ran the general store, "but I can't be seen doing business with you, not with the situation." "What situation?" Clara demanded. Henderson wouldn't meet her eyes. "People are saying you're in league with that wild man, that he's dangerous. I've got a family to think about." It was the same everywhere. Within 2 weeks, Clara couldn't sell her goods in Dustridge. Without income, she couldn't buy supplies. Without supplies, she couldn't bake. The town that had tormented her for years was now attempting to starve her out. Clara reported all of this to Silas during her visits, trying to make light of it, but he saw through her brave face. The situation gnawed at him. He'd thought confronting Tom would be enough, but he'd underestimated the mayor's vindictiveness. "Come live here," Silas urged, "permanently. You don't need them." "And what? Hide in the mountains forever? Let them drive me out of my own home?" Clara shook her head. "I won't give them that satisfaction." "Then let me go down there, talk to the mayor man to man." "No." Clara's voice was firm. "You go down there, and they'll manufacture some excuse to arrest you. Or worse. Aldrich Wickham is powerful in this region. He has connections to the territorial governor. They were at an impasse. Clara refused to abandon her home, and Silas refused to let her face the town's cruelty alone. The tension wore on both of them. Then, one evening in the early summer, Clara didn't come. Silas waited until nightfall, then passed it, anxiety building with each passing hour. Clara never missed a visit without sending word. When dawn broke with no sign of her, Silas gathered his weapons and headed down the mountain. He found Clara's cabin door hanging open, her belongings ransacked. Furniture was overturned, her stores of food destroyed. On the table was a note written in a crude hand. "Go back to your wild man. You're not welcome here." Rage, such as Silas had never known, filled his chest. They'd driven her from her home, destroyed what little she had. And for what? Because she dared to find happiness with him? Silas tracked Clara's trail through the forest with ease. She'd gone to his cabin, but taken a longer route, probably to avoid being followed. He found her halfway there, sitting on a fallen log with her head in her hands, a single bag of possessions at her feet. "Clara!" She looked up, her face streaked with tears. "They destroyed everything, all my mother's things, the preserves I'd been making for winter, everything." Silas sat beside her and pulled her into his arms. She clung to him, sobbing, and he held her while the mountains witnessed her grief. When her tears finally subsided, Silas spoke quietly. "I'm going to make this right." Clara pulled back to look at him. "How?" "I don't know yet, but they can't be allowed to do this, to you or to anyone else. Silas, please, don't do anything that will get you killed or arrested." He kissed her forehead gently. "Trust me." Silas didn't go to Dustridge that day or the next. Instead, he thought, planned, and prepared. He knew that direct violence would only prove Aldrich Wickham right and give the mayor an excuse to call in territorial marshals. Whatever he did had to be legal, public, and undeniable. On the third day, Silas descended to Dustridge in full daylight, Clara at his side. He wore his best buckskins, his hair and beard neatly trimmed. Clara wore a new dress she'd sewn from fabric Silas had traded for, her head held high despite her nervousness. They walked straight to the town square, where a crowd quickly gathered. Aldrich Wickham emerged from the mayor's office, Tom at his side, both looking startled and angry at Silas's appearance. "What's the meaning of this?" Aldrich demanded. Silas's voice carried across the square. "I've come to settle accounts. Clara Brennan's home was destroyed by persons unknown. Her property was vandalized. Her livelihood taken from her. I want to know what the law intends to do about it." Aldrich's face reddened. "The law? You dare invoke the law? You're the one who's been corrupting this poor girl." "Corrupting?" Clara's voice rang out clear and strong. "Is that what you call treating someone with kindness and respect? Mayor Wickham, this town has tormented me since I was a child, mocked me, belittled me, made my life a misery. Silas is the first person who's ever treated me like a human being. If that's corruption, then I'm grateful for it." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Some faces showed shame, others remained hard. "She's been bewitched," Tom interjected. "That mountain savage has addled her mind. I challenge you to prove that." Silas's voice cut through Tom's bluster. "Right here, right now. Call witnesses. Present evidence. Let everyone hear the truth." Aldrich looked uncertain for the first time. A public proceeding wasn't what he'd wanted. He preferred operating in shadows, spreading rumors and fear. But the crowd was watching, waiting, and to refuse would make him look weak. "Very well," Aldrich said. "We'll convene a town meeting. Tonight, everyone who has testimony to offer can speak." That evening, the town hall was packed. Every resident of Dustridge seemed to have crowded inside, drawn by the promise of drama. Aldrich Wickham sat behind a table at the front, playing judge, with Tom and several council members beside him. Silas and Clara sat in the front row, hands clasped. The mayor called the meeting to order. "We're here to address the accusations made by—" "Silas, is that your full name?" "It's the only one I use." Aldrich sniffed. "Very well. Silas claims that Miss Brennan's property was damaged and that he wants justice. Before we address that, I think we need to discuss his own conduct. Multiple witnesses have testified to his threatening behavior." "Let them testify now," Silas said. "In front of everyone." Tom stood. "He attacked me on his mountain, held a knife to my throat, threatened to kill me. After you rode to his home, uninvited, armed, and insulted both him and Miss Brennan," Silas countered. "That's not an attack. That's self-defense." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Aldrich tried to regain control. "Be that as it may—" "May I speak?" Clara stood, her voice steady, despite her trembling hands. "This is highly irregular," Aldrich protested. "Let her speak," someone called from the back. It was Mrs. Henderson, the general store owner's wife. "We've gossiped about Clara for years. Least we can do is hear her out." Aldrich had no choice but to agree. Clara faced the crowd, the people who'd made her life hell for as long as she could remember. "You all know me. You've known me since I was born. And you've all spent years making me the object of your ridicule, jokes about my appearance, about my eating, about my worth as a person. You made me feel worthless. Some people had the grace to look ashamed, others remained defiant. Then I met Silas. He saved my life from a wolf, gave me shelter, treated me with kindness. Over time, I fell in love with him, and he with me. That's the whole scandalous truth. Two lonely people found each other and dared to be happy. But he's—" Tom started. "He's what?" Clara's eyes flashed. "A hermit. Someone who lives differently than you. That doesn't make him evil or dangerous. It makes him someone who chose solitude over your cruelty." The words hung in the air like an accusation. An elderly woman stood in the back, Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived in Dustridge longer than anyone. "The girl's right. We've been cruel. I've been cruel, making fun of her like we did, when all she ever did was try to make an honest living. Ought to be ashamed." "Hear, hear," several voices agreed. Aldrich Wickham saw the tide turning against him. Regardless of past unpleasantness, that doesn't excuse the mountain man's violence. "What violence?" Silas stood, his presence commanding the room. "I defended myself against armed men who rode to my home threatening me. I protected a woman I love from slander and abuse. If that's violence, then so be it. But I've never harmed anyone who didn't threaten me first." "He's telling the truth," another voice called out. It was Billy Crothers, the blacksmith's apprentice who'd mocked Clara so often. "I was there that day, Mayor. Your Tom drew his weapon first. The mountain man he just outmaneuvered us." Tom turned red with fury, but he couldn't deny it. Silas pressed his advantage. "Now, about Clara's home. Someone destroyed her property, drove her from her house. That's a crime by any law. I want to know who did it, and I want them held accountable." The room fell silent. No one wanted to confess. Then Martha Wickham stood, her face pale. "It was my husband, and Tom, and some of Tom's friends, they thought Aldrich said it would drive a wedge between you and Clara, make her see sense and come back to town. Aldrich's face went white, then red. "Martha, shut your mouth." "No." Martha's voice shook, but held firm. "I've stood by and let you bully this town long enough. I won't be party to this anymore. They destroyed that girl's home, and it was wrong. All of this has been wrong." The room erupted. People shouted questions, accusations, condemnations. Aldrich Wickham tried to maintain order, but his authority was crumbling. Council members who'd supported him quietly slipped toward the exits. Silas raised his hand, and somehow the room quieted. "Here's what's going to happen. Mayor Wickham and his son are going to replace everything they destroyed, every stick of furniture, every jar of preserves, everything, and they're going to do it publicly so everyone knows justice was done." "You can't make me," Aldrich started. "Can I? Because it seems to me you have two choices. Make restitution voluntarily, or I take this to the territorial authorities. Tell them how a mayor used his position to persecute an innocent woman, how he destroyed private property, how he incited violence. I wonder how the governor would feel about that." Aldrich Wickham was trapped, and he knew it. The law he'd hidden behind for years suddenly offered him no protection. He looked around at the crowd, saw the judgment in their eyes, and deflated. "Fine," he said, his voice bitter. "We'll replace what was damaged." "And one more thing," Clara added, stepping forward. "An apology, a public apology, to both of us." It took every ounce of Aldrich's pride to force the words out, but he did it. Tom followed suit, though his apology sounded more like grinding glass than remorse. As the meeting dissolved, people approached Clara and Silas. Some apologized for years of cruelty. Others simply nodded in respect. A few remained hostile, but they were the minority now. Mrs. Patterson took Clara's hands in her weathered ones. "You've got more courage than all of us combined, girl. I'm sorry we never saw it before." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Thank you." True to their word, Aldrich and Tom Wickham spent the next month replacing everything they'd destroyed. It galled them both, but they had no choice. The whole town was watching, and any deviation from the agreement would destroy what little authority Aldrich had left. Clara didn't move back into her cabin, though. She stayed with Silas in the mountains, helping him with his work, cooking, and building a life together. They were married by a traveling minister that autumn, in a simple ceremony with the mountains as witnesses. Word spread about what had happened in Dustridge. Other isolated communities heard the story of the woman who'd been mocked and the mountain man who'd helped her find justice. It became a cautionary tale about the cost of cruelty and the power of standing up for what's right. Clara still went to Dustridge to sell her goods at market, but the reception was different now. People treated her with respect, even warmth. Her baking was as popular as ever, but now, when someone complimented her pies or bread, it wasn't followed by a cruel joke. Silas accompanied her on these trips, and while he never became comfortable with town life, he tolerated it for Clara's sake. Some of the men who'd ridden up the mountain that day even became tentative friends, won over by his skill as a hunter and his quiet integrity. Aldrich Wickham remained mayor for another year before quietly stepping down. Broken by the scandal, Tom left Dustridge entirely, seeking fortune elsewhere and carrying the lesson of his humiliation with him. On a clear winter evening, as snow fell softly outside their cabin, Clara and Silas sat by the fire. She was working on a quilt, and he was carving a wooden spoon, a domestic scene that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked. "Getting involved with me? All the trouble it caused?" Silas set down his carving and pulled her close. "Regret finding the woman I love? Regret standing up for what's right? Never." Clara leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the years of mockery, the pain, the loneliness, and then she thought about Silas, about the love they'd built, about the life they were creating together. "They used to laugh at me," she said softly, "call me names, make me feel worthless. I know, but they were wrong about everything." "Yes, they were." Clara smiled, tilting her face up to kiss him. "I love you, Silas. I love you, Clara. Every part of you. Always." Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to their happiness. The town below might gossip and judge, but here in their cabin, surrounded by love and respect, Clara and Silas had found something more valuable than gold or acceptance or approval. They'd found home. They'd found each other, and that was worth any price the world might demand